The greatest mystery in world culture has been resolved. The Shakespeare plays were written by Shakespeare, and that is beyond doubt. This phrase forms the title of a book issued recently by the oldest university press in the world, operating at Cambridge since 1534. You can't get more official than that. Since that publication, however, the flow of dissident publications on this subject has gathered speed, volume and intensity. In the field of Marlowe studies, several recent books have extended and enriched the argument in favour of Marlowe as the probable author. We think there is a strong possibility that, under the threat of inquisition, torture and death, he was helped by Lord Burleigh and others to fake his death, disappeared into exile and write all the works attributed to him and to William Shakespeare. We know how this must have been planned and executed, and, believe it or not, some of the details are written unmistakably into well-known plays such as You Like It and Measure for Measure. This talk and the book that I have nearly finished writing are intended as a modest contribution to that growing body of evidence which has already brought us to the brink of certainty that our man is the true author. My broad aim is to rewrite the 50-year-old history of English Renaissance drama by emphasising some aspects that have been undervalued or not even noticed. This amazing story began with Lord Burleigh, who, as Sir William Cecil, commissioned, preserved and protected the first blank verse play, The Tragedy of Gorboduc. The innovation then slept undisturbed for an entire generation before being taken up by Christopher Marlowe, the greatest innovator and practitioner of English verse drama, and during its 25 years of furious activity, blank verse tragedy set up a network of strong interrelationships between several dozen works of high quality, of which two famous plays, Hamlet and The Tempest, consummated and terminated this short-lived genre. But all of that needs to be properly argued at substantial length. For today's purposes, I want to focus briefly on one or two patterns of authorial behaviour which amount to obsessions, characterising the whole genre and growing in intensity with the passage of those 25 years. First, the playwright's unnatural fascination with the life and works of Christopher Marlowe. This acknowledged proclivity has been described as stalking even by Stratfordian critics. Second, the agonising experience of lifelong displacement caused by banishment and exile. And third, the challenging idea of returning to life from what looks like permanent extinction in death. Christopher Marlowe, banishment and survival after death, these three undeniable fixations work together persuasively to draw us ever further away from Stratford, ever closer to Canterbury. Let's look first at the subject of death in this context. A relevant recent publication comes to hand, Shakespeare's Dead, written by two scholars with no axe to grind on the authorship question. But here are what Simon Palfrey and Emma Smith say, introducing their own work. Our book reveals the unique ways in which Shakespeare brings dying, death and the dead to life. The dead come to life, ghosts haunt the living, and scenes of mourning are subverted by the fact that the supposed corpse still breathes. This book celebrates the paradox, the life and death in Shakespeare. And here's the significant word: there are many ways in which death can be survived. In the second scene of The Tempest, we are given an explanation of how the storm depicted in the first scene came about. Commissioned by Prospero, it was stirred up and controlled by the spirit Ariel, who ensured that despite the turbulence, no one came to any harm. He reports on this event, describing how Ferdinand, son of Antonio, leapt into the waves before anyone else, but was brought to safety on the shore by Ariel himself. Ferdinand naturally assumed that his father must have been drowned, hence his mournful air when he emerges onto the same scene shortly afterwards, still sedated by some easygoing music. Ariel then drops all jollity and sings again to Ferdinand, this time confirming his worst fears. His father's body lies 30 feet under water, already turning into coral and pearl as it undergoes a sea change. The 40 exquisite words woven into this tiny masterpiece, "Full fathom 5 thy father lies," are well loved and frequently recalled. At least 40 musical settings have found their way into our national culture. There are good reasons for us to dwell on them for a moment. First, this incident, an example of faked death, eventually overcome by real life, reflects one of the chief preoccupations of this work and not a few others. We're never told why Ariel chose to deceive Ferdinand rather than reassure him, but his doing so has resulted in a paradox of mixed mortality. Ferdinand's father seems to be both dead to some and still living for others. Now, don't forget this concept. We shall have need of it later. If this hovering between death and life was a one-off curiosity, we could decently ignore it and pass by. But no, this curious enigma haunts many of the works of Shakespeare, noticeably intensifying as time proceeds. In the last 4 plays, it amounts to nothing less than an obsession, markedly characterising all 4 late plays: Pericles, Cymbeline, The Winter's Tale and The Tempest. These 4 Shakespearean romancers come together at the end of the playwright's writing life to sum up his achievement and his main preoccupations. All 4 plays are so similar in this regard you can hardly tell them apart. They actually tell a similar story 4 times over, and their content demands to be taken seriously because of its location at the end of a very distinguished career. In Pericles, the hero's wife Thesa is presumed dead and cast into the sea in a chest. When she comes round, she believes conversely that her husband is dead. Later on, he is falsely informed that his daughter Marina has died. All 3 will rise again from fakery into real life before the ending of the play. In Cymbeline, Posthumus, what an interesting name, though the stress is actually on the second syllable, posthumous, assumes that instructions for the murder of his daughter have been carried out, and the 2 stolen sons of Cymbeline, Guiderius and Arviragus, are dead to their father 20 years after their abduction until their restoration in the last act. As to The Winter's Tale, Leontes' wife Hermione, his daughter Perdita, and his son Mamilius are all declared dead for different reasons until they return to life at the end. Why is the playwright so hung up on such an unlikely seeming turn of events? One clue to a possible explanation may be detected in a sharp observation by Darrell Pinkson. There is so much exile, banishment, disguise, mistaken identities and dirty tricks in Cymbeline that one is tempted to believe that the only author who could possibly have written it must have experienced some of it. It's worth noting that even as the Tempest dies, it is itself reborn into a new role, instancing the poet's own saying, "What's past is prologue." It returns as an effective prologue to the first folio of 1623. The Tempest is both valedictory and introductory, an eye-catching instance of literary life in death. How many of the Tempest characters return from the dead? The surprising answer is that in their various ways, all of them manage this unlikely feat. Prospero and Miranda ostensibly perished when set adrift years ago. 12 years later, at the beginning of the play, the separated survivors assume that the missing people must have perished at sea. This process of returning from death to life even applies to the two non-human members of the cast, Ariel and Caliban, both of whom had been imprisoned in a death-like state within a tree and a rock respectively, only to be restored to new life by Prospero and eventually given their freedom. The idea of cheating death not only remained popular with the author of The Tempest, it turns into a gathering obsession. The revenants will return from all points of the compass and from years ago. This is the only play in which everybody survives apparent death and no one at all actually dies. And more often than not, banishment plays a role, years long and painful, in the fake death scenario. Banishment is equivalent to death, but both forces, banishment and death, can be vanquished by resurrection in one of its guises. This theme appears everywhere in the Shakespeare canon. The terms banish, banished, or banishment are used over 200 times in 28 different works, 3/4 of the entire Shakespeare canon. The two works that stand out in this respect are Richard II, which has 36 references, and Romeo and Juliet, 31. Perhaps significantly, these two works appeared in the same year, 1595. Banishment seems to have been at the forefront of the author's mind in the very period during which Marlowe is thought to have run away from England at the end of May 1593 and stayed away for some time in self-imposed exile. But the most painful outpouring of anguish at the idea of banishment occurs halfway through Romeo and Juliet, following the death of Tybalt and the prince's decision to send his killer not to execution but into exile. The nurse, reporting this news to Juliet, initiates a long passage characterised by an obsessive preoccupation with banishment. Tybalt is gone, and Romeo banished. Romeo that killed him, he is banished. Juliet is quick on the update. Tybalt is dead, and Romeo banished. That banished, that one word banished, hath slain 10,000 Tybalts. Romeo is banished. To speak that word is father, mother, Tybalt, Romeo, Juliet. All slain, all dead. Romeo is banished in that word's death. Wash they his wounds with tears? Mine shall be spent when theirs are dry, for Romeo's banishment. Romeo himself rapidly adopts the same vocabulary. The friar assures him that exile is better than death. What he must think of is not body's death, but body's banishment. Our hero will have none of this. Banishment, be merciful, say death, for exile hath more terror in his look, much more than death. Do not say banishment. This goes on for some time. It is hyperbole at its most hyperbolical. Reason is shouted down by the author, for whom the agony of exile is such a persistent obsession that he takes pleasurable relief in all this understandable fulmination. The resulting cacophony is a masterpiece of overwriting, not to be fully understood without reference to the play's literary and historical context. Thus it is that, at the very end of his career, the poet-dramatist adorns his final works with several associated preoccupations. The knowledge that there are many ways in which death can be survived, and a longing to change his state from the slavery of exile to the joy of release from it. That same sense of hope for release from captivity characterises the final words of the final work, The Tempest. Indeed, without this interpretation of the epilogue, it is hard to understand what the writer could possibly mean about still being confined by you, the reader, audience, posterity, and in despair, unless he be set free from confinement by prayer and your indulgence. But there is even more to these obsessions than meets the eye. The Tempest certainly brings to a head several fixations weighing upon the author. But the most remarkable development is this. The playwright, with at least 36 works under his belt, is still so obsessed with another contemporary playwright, Christopher Marlowe, that he uses his valedictory work to rewrite a Christopher Marlowe classic in its entirety, leaving it scarcely disguised. Even the names of the two heroes are Latin synonyms, Faustus and Prospero. Here is a strange event in the annals of world literature. At his own retirement party, the author of Shakespeare canon does something unexpected and unique. He turns the spotlight away from himself and onto a fellow playwright. There is only one explanation of this unlikely termination of a literary career, and I'm not the first to discover it. The Stratford businessman can be dismissed as irrelevant. Faustus, Prospero, and Marlowe are one and the same person. This fact explains the inexplicable. And here's a simple puzzle with which to amuse admirers of Elizabethan drama. All that is required is to determine which play is indicated by the following outline of its story and method. The work in question, one of the finest examples of English blank verse drama, tells a story about power, truth, creativity, knowledge, and the art or science of magic. It is focused on a single individual with a name deriving from a Latin adjective meaning fortunate or propitious, a highly educated scholar whose fascination for all things natural and supernatural has raised him to the status of a magus. He carries a staff as the symbol and instrument of his magical authority. This man can communicate with the non-human world and bring forth spirits into everyday life. Many a scene in his play erupts with thunder and lightning preceding the arrival on stage of spirits or demons, and even when these creatures are off stage, they're never far from mind. Creatures emerge to enact mask-like dumb show performances depicting shadowy demonic forms. Using spirits and imps as obliging intermediaries, our protagonist seems also to be in touch with deeper and perhaps darker forces. But among the spirits, there's one in particular who serves our hero as a personal magic-working factotum. He can do magic tricks like invoking or imposing invisibility, putting a whole group of people to sleep, or getting up a huge storm. Spirit and magus work well together. He is the master, but they do the magic. As if to soften any painful ideas, humour is encouraged in this play, which even includes a named professional jester who teams up with other rough and ready persons to entertain the audience with fun and games. New events are likely to be preceded, interrupted, or accompanied by music, dance and singing, or even tomfoolery and histrionics. The agonised hero spends most of the play in torment because of his scholarly obsession with pushing our understanding of the world and its purpose to its very limits and beyond, while working out what to believe, what to aim for, and how to behave. By the end, we are hard put to accept this pattern of experience as profitable, since it seems to dwell on negative values, the poverty of human thinking, philosophy and religion, the shallowness of our thin little lives, the difficulty of achieving power, significance, control or victory, an inevitable disappointment even if you manage to do so. At the end of the play, and not for the first time, our hero begs for the benefit of prayer, We ourselves are actively enlisted to pray for him. However, his own lack of confidence in that faculty shows hope to be threadbare, and this inadequacy leaves us all in or near to despair. And when this happens, you've arrived at your destination. All of this, of course, is not one play, but two. Dr. Faustus, followed by its palimpsest, The Tempest. It is important to emphasise how exceptional these two works are. They resemble each other much more than they resemble any other English play. Each is a starburst of energy and beauty, an extravaganza of pyrotechnics and poetry. You've been told that they were written by two separate people, but it will be easier for us if we all think of them as coming from the same pen and the same mind. Christopher Marlowe wrote both plays across a gap of about 22 years. In between, he was forced to run away from events and pretend to be dead. The anguish of exile screams from so many of his pages. This author has been sustained throughout only by the forlorn hope of rebirth. He wants urgently to be acknowledged as the author of all of those great works. And who wouldn't want that? Once again, Darrell Pinkston sums this up to a nicety. The Tempest serves as a metaphor of Marlowe's banishment and exile. His plea is moving. Release me from the spell of banishment, or I despair. It is still not too late to grant his request. Meanwhile, let us celebrate the singular achievement of a remarkable historical figure. Faced with the famous choice to be or not to be, he discovered an unexpected alternative. Like Ferdinand's father, remember him? And so many of those other heroes and heroines, he managed to be and not to be. Let us end on a note of irony. Sir Jonathan Bate, the most outspoken opponent of all anti-Stratfordian thinking, which he routinely dismisses as ridiculous, writes in these terms about the unbreakable hold that Marlowe undeniably exerted over Shakespeare. Marlowe did come back from the dead after the Deptford stabbing. His ghost astonishes us even as we read and hear the verse of Shakespeare. I wonder why.